Our second elasticity is the price elasticity of supply. So this is a lot like the price elasticity of demand, but we're looking at the supply side of the market. So we're measuring how responsive our sellers are in terms of adjusting quantity supplied in response to price changes. So if we look at the supply curve here, and as we're moving along the supply curve from this point to this point, we see an increase in price with a relatively small increase in quantity. And so when the price changes, we see a small quantity supplied response, and we would say that we have inelastic supply. However, if we look at the second supply curve here, the same increase in price causes a much larger increase in quantity supplied. And so we would say that our sellers are much more responsive, or that they have elastic supply. So the price elasticity of supply measures the percent change in quantity supplied that results from a 1% change in price, and again we're using the midpoint formula. So we can measure the price elasticity of supply as the ratio of percent change in quantity supplied divided by percent change in price. And because we're using this midpoint formula, we can also express that as the change in quantity supplied divided by average quantity supplied. And then we're dividing that by the change in price divided by average price. Again, if you like the expanded equation, we can look at the change here, the new quantity minus the old quantity divided by the average, and we've got the new price minus the old price divided by the average. So interpreting the price elasticity of supply, this parallels what we talked about with interpreting the price elasticity of demand. Now, based on the law of supply, if the price is increasing, quantity supplied is also increasing. And so we would get a positive measurement. If the price is decreasing, we expect to see quantity supplied also decreasing. So a negative divided by a negative, we still get a positive elasticity measurement. So if we get a measurement that's exactly equal to 0, that simply means that there's no change in quantity supplied, that our sellers are perfectly inelastic. They don't respond the quantity at all to price changes. A measurement between 0 and 1 would tell us that the numerator here, our percent change in quantity supplied, is smaller than our denominator, the percent change in price. Or percent change in quantity supplied simply smaller than percent change in price. We would interpret that as being inelastic supply, a fairly small change in quantity in response to the price change. If the 2% changes are exactly equal, we're going to get a ratio of 1, and we call that unitary elastic supply. Again, there's nothing really special about other than it is sort of the dividing line between what we consider to be elastic versus inelastic supply. And finally, if our elasticity measurement is greater than 1, that tells us that the quantity supplied is greater than the percent change in quantity supplied is greater than the percent change in price. The numerator here is larger than the denominator, giving us a fraction greater than 1, and we would call that elastic supply. Looking at the factors that influence how elastic or inelastic supply is, the most important is probably the time horizon. So over a narrow time horizon, we tend to see more inelastic supply measurements. Over longer time horizons, we tend to see more elastic supply measurements. And again, this simply has to do with the fact of how able are sellers to respond to the price change. Over short periods of time, it's harder to make those adjustments. Over longer periods of time, it's relatively more easy to make those adjustments. As an example, my mom owns a farm in southwest Minnesota where she grows corn and soybeans and alfalfa. So if corn prices were to go up right now, she would love to be selling more corn, but if we're focusing on this growing season, the time horizon's too short for her to make adjustments, and so, her elasticity of supply is going to be perfectly inelastic because she doesn't have time to make that adjustment. If the price of corn goes up and stays up, then my mom might start shifting some of her land toward growing more corn and less of the other crops, and we would see that we get a more elastic response. Another determinant of the elasticity of supply is simply how quickly our average costs or cost per unit rise as firms try to expand their output, increasing their quantity supplied. So if the price of the product goes up, firms would love to be able to sell more product, but if it's very costly to increase their quantity, those increases in costs are going to wipe out the increased price effect. And so we're going to get relatively small response in an inelastic measurement. But if it's easy to increase output without causing our average cost to go up, if the average costs increase slowly, we're going to get a larger supply response and a more elastic supply curve. Finally, the geographic definition of the market has an impact on the measurement here. When we look at broad geographic regions, we tend to get more inelastic responses. When we look at narrow geographic regions, we tend to get more elastic responses. So, a nice example of this, 2 summers ago when we had the straight line winds that knocked out my power, I woke up in the morning, I had to get to work, I was busy all day, I got home at 6 o'clock and our power was still out, and I thought, ooh, we're going to start losing food that's in our freezer, I need to go get some ice, which was not the ideal time to be buying ice because everyone else had already been out buying ice. So I went to 4 different gas stations, grocery stores, whatever, before I found a seller with ice. And part of the reason that they were able to get the ice in is because there was a narrow geographic response. Power was knocked out in Stevens Point, but it was not knocked out in the surrounding areas. And so stores like Quick Trip were bringing in ice in from their other locations, allowing them to respond to this. If we had a power outage that knocked out the whole state, it's harder to bring ice in from outside, and so we would get a smaller or more inelastic response. So that's the price elasticity of supply, and that concludes this section of the lecture. The last section of Chapter 5, we're going to focus on the other 2 elasticities, the income elasticity of demand and the cross-price elasticity of demand.